Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome on this rainy day. Thank you so much for making the effort to join us in person, no less. So welcome to this event, Child or Soldier, Adolescents in Armed Conflict in a Securitized World. If you don't recognize that title, then you're probably in the wrong room, and now is a time to subtly leave. But if you recognize that title, you're in the right place. I'm Monette Zard. I'm director of the Program on Forced Migration and Health and co-director of the Care and Protection of Children Learning Network, affectionately known as CPC. And we're delighted to be co-sponsoring today's conversation with the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism. So the recruitment and use of children by armed forces and non-state armed groups continues to be a major protection concern in numerous conflicts around the world. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, Columbia faculty, along with many others in the child rights community, were very engaged in conversations around the strengthening of protection frameworks for such children, including the rehabilitation and ultimately reintegration into communities of boys and girls who had found themselves recruited in this way. And of course, also holding accountable those who had perpetrated such grave violations against children, including through the International Criminal Court. Over the last few years, however, we've witnessed a distinct shift in how we talk about and approach children and youth who are recruited into violent and extremist groups, particularly post 9/11 in the context of counterterrorism measures. Witness, for example, the heated debates around how to characterize someone like Shamima Begum, the UK teenager who was recruited into ISIS when she was 15 and is now petitioning to retain her citizenship and be allowed to return to the United Kingdom. I think this provides us with a lens into the heated debates around vulnerability and agency, protection versus punishment, that are playing out very visibly in the UK media. But much less visible are the hundreds, perhaps thousands of adolescent boys, some as young as 12, detained in northeast Syria, for example, in so-called rehabilitation centers in appalling conditions that belie any intention of rehabilitation or reintegration. Many are there for no other reason than the fear elicited by their gender and age and the mere possibility of recruitment by extremist groups. This is a pattern we see playing out across the Middle East and elsewhere. And it is this shrinking of the humanitarian and protection space for children impacted by armed conflict, and particularly, I would say, adolescent boys, that we will explore in today's conversation with our wonderful panel. So to guide us, I'm delighted to introduce our moderator, Azmat Khan. Professor Khan is the Birch Assistant Professor of Journalism and Director of the Simon and June Lee Center for Global Journalism. Her work grapples with the human costs of war, and she is an investigative reporter for both the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, as well as a Carnegie Fellow. Her investigations for the New York Times, the PBS series Frontline, and BuzzFeed's investigations team has catalyzed widespread policy impact and won more than a dozen awards. They include a Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting, a National Magazine Award for Public Interest Journalism, a National Magazine Award for Reporting, a Polk Award for Military Reporting, and the list goes on and on. Her multi-part series in the New York Times, The Civilian Casualty Files, for which she was awarded the Pulitzer, was the culmination of more than 5 years of her work reporting on the ground in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan in more than 100 civilian casualty incidents in those places, and included more than 1,300 formerly secret military records that she obtained in a legal battle with the Pentagon. Khan serves on the board of directors for the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting. I promised you I'd keep it short, right?
Meeting. We had a conversation before this, please.
Okay, I'll keep it short. All right. And so should I just conclude by saying you could be in no better hands than with Professor Khan. So I'm going to hand it over to you right now.
Thank you so much, Monette. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here. And it is such a pleasure to be here with such a distinguished panel of experts, people who come at this question of child or soldier and the different ways of looking at these issues and how they've evolved over time from a variety of legal, ethical, and journalistic perspectives that I'm very excited to delve into with each of you. And for our audience, I wanted to just take a moment to introduce each of you. So next to me is Faith Nimineh, the Senior Advisor, Humanitarian Affairs at the ChildFund Alliance. Faith is the Senior Advisor at the ChildFund Alliance. For over 20 years, she's worked in humanitarian development, implementing child protection programs in conflict and post-conflict settings, championing the rights of children and people affected by conflicts and disasters. She's been involved in humanitarian and development work, advocating for the protection of children from abuse, exploitation, and violence, including in her native country, Liberia, where she saw and experienced the impact of armed conflict on children and their families. Her key areas of expertise include child protection in emergencies and development programs, child participation, child safeguarding, policy development, and prevention and response to violence against children. We're also joined next to her by Juan Arredondo, an adjunct assistant professor of journalism here at Columbia J School. He's a Colombian-American documentary photographer and filmmaker who's chronicled human rights issues and social and armed conflicts through Latin America, Ukraine, and the US. He's a regular contributor to the New York Times and National Geographic. His photographs have been featured in the Wall Street Journal, Newsweek, Vanity Fair, and aired on ESPN, PBS, and HBO, among many others. For his work, he's been awarded the World Press Photo, the Overseas Press Club Award, an ICRC Humanitarian Award, among others. He's, in addition to being an assistant professor of journalism, he was also a Nieman Fellow at Harvard and has taught at other places, including Arizona State University, where he's taught journalism, photojournalism, multimedia, sound, and video. And lastly, we're joined by Dr. Ezequiel Heffes, the director of the Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict. Ezequiel, it's an organization that is a network of leading human rights and humanitarian NGOs working to advance children's rights in conflict settings. Prior to joining Watchlist, Ezequiel worked for Geneva Call and the ICRC in various operational positions, engaging armed actors on child protection issues. He holds a PhD from the University of Leiden, an LLM from the Geneva Academy of IHL and of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights, and a law degree from the University of Buenos Aires. He's widely published on different international law issues and is the author of Detention by Non-State Armed Groups Under International Law of Cambridge University Press, and the co-editor of International Humanitarian Law and Non-State Actors, and of Armed Groups and International Law in the Shadowland of Legality and Illegality. So please give all of them a warm welcome. Faith, I'd like to start with you to just set us up with this understanding of this issue. And this question, I remember, as many of you might, in the 90s, the sort of term child soldier, which was widely being used. But can you walk us through the evolution of these terms over time and how that's changed in a more securitized world?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you, and I'd just like to say thank you to the organizers for having me here today and to share my experience over the years with all of you. And so I promised that my presentation will be more of a conversation based on my experience and also growing up in a country where we had 14 years of civil war. And actually at the time, I was also a child. So I could have been a child soldier, as they were called at the time. In particular, I could have been abducted by one of the armed forces to be a wife to some of the fighting forces. But because I had real strong family protection at the time, my parents protected me, and we kind of escaped and we went to another country for a while. So fast forward to that, I returned to Liberia as a child still, completed high school, all in the midst of conflict. So for 14 years of my life, while going to school as a young person, going to university, up to my career, I was in a conflict setting. So So this was a situation where I first witnessed it as, young people signing up either voluntarily or the armed forces kind of forcibly recruited them to be part of the fighting groups because they needed soldiers to fight. So if you were at the time vulnerable and in my country, you would be recruited into one of those groups to fight along with the many different fighting forces that we had at the time. But as I kind of graduated and went to school to study actually journalism, because I wanted to report about these violations, but then in Liberia at the time, it was not a friendly space for people wanting to be a journalist. So I went to school for 2 years. In my junior year, I switched to study social work and sociology because I kind of felt that I would have more space to talk for children and for people affected by conflict. And also because my mom told me she was not going to come to the prison to release me if I ever got put into prison. And she was like, you need to study something that will help you stay out of trouble. But anyway, as I began my career in this area, with Save the Children UK at the time in West and Central Africa. It was the time when children were used as soldiers across the West Africa region, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Ivory Coast. The whole region was all in conflict. And we also know the time when there was also a child soldier situation in East Africa, the Ugandan situation. So during that time, we were pretty much working with these children that have been recruited during the time of the war and given guns to fight and treated their rights were violated. And our job was to design programs to be able to have them reintegrated after disarmament into the society. But also at the same time, the UN passed, and that part I will leave most of that to Ezequiel to talk about, but we also saw the UN Security Council and the UNGA passing laws to protect children in the form of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict mandate, which came into force because the Gracia Michel report talked about children that were involved in armed conflict being recruited and used. So based on that, the Security Council and the UNGA passed this resolution to protect children from armed conflict. And after that, we've seen several other resolutions, 13 more, for the protection of children from armed conflict. So I think for me, as we look at the name change and how children were treated those days, and then we fast forward to today, we see a different kind of way children are being used in these situations of armed conflicts, because conflicts have changed, there have been new dynamics, there's been counterterrorism measures, and all these different contexts where they're being used now as suicide bombers, like you saw with Boko Haram in Nigeria and other places. And even for us who do programming, we had to also change our programming for how we responded to children from the time I started till now. So at ChildFund, we have a different ways we do that. And so in the course of the conversation, I will be talking more about that, but it has been a long journey to now, and we look forward to just discussing along the way. Thank you.
Thank you. And actually, maybe Ezequiel, can you add to some of the sort of evolutions of these understandings that you've seen over time? To also just give, I imagine there's some here in the audience who are not as familiar with some of these issues and some of the controversies over the way that this has been cast over time. Can you illuminate some of that evolution?
Yeah. Now, can you hear me? Yes. Yes, definitely. Thank you for the invitation to be part of the panel today. So, maybe the starting point is 1989, when the Convention on the Rights of the Child was adopted, and that's when children were recognized as every person below the age of 18. And then since 1989 until today, we have international treaties, we have resolutions, we have regional treaties that have, I would say, taken that definition and adapted it for the context of armed conflict situation. So nowadays, just to give you an example, it was mentioned before the Rome Statute. So we have the Convention on the Rights of the Child says that every person below the age of 18 is a child. The Rome Statute says that using and recruiting children below the age of 15 is a war crime, not below the age of 18. So what we see now is that we have different sources because, the diplomatic community and international lawyers, they have kept themselves busy in the last 30 years, putting together different terms and of course, trying to adapt to the changing dynamics of the conflict situations. So in 1989, we had that. Then we have the Rome Statute, but also, before that, we have certain treaties that apply specifically to situations of war. So I don't want to delve into a very legalistic discussion, but what we have, international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, is a body of law that applies to situations, precisely as I said, true armed conflict, that it might be very different to what we know as human rights law, right? So human rights law applies to every time. International humanitarian law applies to situations of armed conflict and has specific standards. So as I said, for instance, it is a war crime to recruit a child below the age of 15. I can go into a different treaties and UN Security Council resolutions dealing with this, but just to say that nowadays it is very much on the agenda of the UN and UN institutions to monitor the situations of children around the world, to monitor the situation specifically of children who are below the age of 18, who can be used and recruited. So this means that children who are, for instance, taking an active role in military operations for one of the parties, or that have, for instance, that are accompanying one of the parties in their military operations, but perhaps are not taking an active military role, or that they can be fulfilling roles at checkpoints, for instance, but again, not necessarily in the combat or military operations of the parties. So now, international law and the development of international law has tried to tackle and to encompass all of these behaviors. Some of them with more success than others, I would say. Yeah.
I want to come to Juan in just a minute, but before that, I want to turn back to you to just give some color about the effects of what you were seeing, about the impact, in Liberia. I would imagine you're seeing what the long-term enduring effects of child recruitment, of that kind of exploitation, about some of the gendered issues of violence within that. What were you seeing, and what were some of the effects through your own work and experiences in Liberia?
Yeah, so during my work at the time, I think I started working as we were called community social worker at the disarmament center, where these young children were coming to be disarmed because the government had declared a ceasefire, and of course the war was coming to an end. And so as a social worker at the center, once the children were disarmed by the military, the UN peacekeepers, they passed them over to child protection agencies, and the staff were us. So we had to rapidly document these children because we were taking them to like a center where we worked with them for reintegration. So we had to document them and take them to our centers, and we had different kinds of programs. We had psychosocial programs for them to talk through some of the traumas that they've been through, and then we also had programs on health. So it was like an integrated program where we had psychosocial support, we had program of healthcare, livelihood, and also for family tracing and reintegration, because we couldn't keep them at the center, because of course, which we will come to, there was the funding for reintegration program as part of a humanitarian response is very short term. So you have to be able to work with them within the time limit of the grant, and then we do reintegration. For those that we could not reintegrate either because the community, they didn't want them anymore based on some of the atrocities that they had committed as child soldiers, we had to arrange a kind of alternative care for them. And there was a lot of work that had to be done, of course, with the host communities, because these were children that were taken back to these communities that they had, the community had classified as, child soldiers who they saw through the lens of people violating their rights, they didn't see them as victims. Like Ezequiel mentioned, some of the legal framework said children should be seen as victims, especially if they were forced to fight. but the community didn't see them that way. So our job was to really work with the community to accept them and to start the reintegration process with us. Girls were not easily taken back, especially if they were very young and they were adopted as maybe sex slave, and they come back home, they have 2, 3 children, and communities didn't want them anymore. Sometimes we had to do some cleansing ceremony to it was all like a spiritual thing. So we saw all of that. But like you said, there was trauma that has lived with these children for a very long time, because as soldiers, they were made to do things that were unimaginable, right?
I think maybe now is perhaps a good time to actually introduce some of Juan's work. Journalists often come to this from the perspective, and do you have the clicker, or do I need to grab it? Okay, great, okay. Journalists often are meeting with children who are active participants of armed conflict, and it raises a number of ethical questions, not just in terms of how do we describe them, but also, the ethics of photographing or spending time with or identifying, and shedding light on what is a very underreported but incredibly consequential issue. So Juan, I was hoping you might be able to take us through some of your own experiences documenting children in armed conflict in places like Colombia and elsewhere where you've spent time.
So thank you, Asma. Thank you for the panelists for allowing me to be part of this, and for Mindy for putting this together. So thank you very much, and thank you for attending. So my work focuses in, the work that I'll show you is in Colombia. Just to give you context, Colombia have been almost in 60 years of internal conflict, one of the longest standing conflicts in the Western Hemisphere. And I began to do this project in 2014. And I just happened to stumble onto this armed group. So this is the 25th Front of ELN. In ELN, in Colombia, we have several armed groups. FARC, FARC is the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. ELN is the National Liberation Army, and other smaller groups. This is the second largest group, and I was doing work for the International Red Cross. It was humanitarian work, and we came across this front of about 25 teenagers. Most of them, they were living at the time in the Pacific Coast. So geographically, the Pacific coast of Colombia is of high interest, especially for drug trafficking, because that's the way out of cocaine to go up to Mexico and other places. And so it's a very contested area, and it's an area where these armed groups usually operate. And that's where forced recruitment happens. And so, given a little bit of that context, I began to photograph this front. I was there for 4 days, and I was given permission by the commanders to photograph the children, obviously if their faces were covered. And I came back with those photographs, and I was starting to look, as a Colombian, I was also grew up in the middle of a conflict, more in the urban side than on the countryside, where you see more that this happens. And I wanted to really dive into what is it, the causes of forced recruitment. To my surprise, not a lot of this have been documented, photographed, and so I wanted to dive into that. And through that, I began to do work with nonprofits, through the government. There was a lot of resistance from the government because this is a very difficult issue. Not a lot was being done. There were not enough campaigns to prevent recruitment. And to be quite frank, for some Colombians living in the cities, this was a remove issue that had nothing to do with them. And so I began to, so this is the poster that we have for the seminar. But I began by going to the places where this forced recruitment was taking place, right? And as a photographer, you try to play a little bit with the significance and symbolisms of the loss of innocence. Some of the communities that were highly affected by forced recruitment are indigenous and Afro-Colombians, where there's extreme poverty, where this notion of state does not exist, where there is a failed state, and these armed groups come to fill that gap. So they become the arbiters, they become the doctors, they become the government for most of these groups. But it's also the failed state that represents coming to in a promise of building schools, building hospitals, and never getting done. And so this is the perfect ground for these groups to come in and conscript children into their ranks. A lot of them do it because of necessity. And in some of these places, what I found was that there was no, even living within their communities, it was better to be part of a group because they at least had 3 meals a day, they had a tent, and someone to protect them. That, as basic as that, it was what I was coming across. I was also coming across communities who had an agreement with the armed groups and say, well, you've given us some sort of protection, in exchange I'll give my children to be part of the group. In other cases, it was because there was nothing else for them to do, and they were hired, paid, and there were many forms of recruitment, as I hope to show you. But again, these are communities that are very remote. They are at the mercy of these groups. And one of the ways of beginning to recruit, at least in Colombia, so this is a family who is preparing marijuana. And so, but this is marijuana that is being trafficked by the armed group. And so children begin by just working for the armed groups. This is Jaime. He is what we know in Colombia as raspachín. So it's someone literally that translates to scraper. So they scrape the leaves of the coca plant. And for him, it was more profitable to be part of the coca collection and work for an armed group than to stay in high school. Because once he graduated, there was no job offers. And so that also broke the dynamics of families and these communities. And that's the way that later on they became part of the armed group. But I also saw a lot of violence against children. A lot of communities are violent. There's a lot of violence. There's conflict, retaliation for armed groups if they collaborate with the army or the government. In some instances, forced displacement. Colombia has around 6 million internally displaced, and about 6 million, about half of them are children and women. And so this is at a school in Quibdó in Chocó in the Pacific Coast, where the 400 families were taken into a high school to live in the high school. So that generates a second displacement because the kids that were attending that school can no longer come to school. So you saw a lot of that dynamic. And then later, I was fortunate to get access to a reintegration center for indigenous and Afro-Colombian former child soldiers. And their philosophy was to give the former child soldiers tools to go back to their communities, especially through agriculture. But the truth of it is that they couldn't go back to their communities. Faith was saying exactly, there was some stigma from the communities, but also the armed groups still operated in the places that they came from. So they couldn't go back because there were going to be some retaliation. So they were left to fend for themselves. Usually when they reached the age of 18, they would get a check, about $2,000, and that was it. And you have to deal with whatever consequences they are. Some of them were fortunate to start a family, but others just fell into criminality, and I lost track. I followed 10 of the children. Elvira was one of them, and you'll see her in a picture later on. So this is at the Attention Center. This is her collecting eggs. And most of them in this Attention Center, like I said, they were Afro-Colombians and indigenous. But a lot of the children, what they resourced to was this military training of having a leader, of following one, and that was what most of the people at the Attention Center they were trying to rewire and to, at least give some coping mechanisms to some of the former child soldiers so they can become part of a society, whatever that meant. But it was hard. It was hard because they always follow this military mentality or leader, and they were having a hard time trying to give them enough tools to come back to society. Part of it is being disciplined, getting up in the morning, having a purpose, folding your clothes, as you see here. But you see that while you had the pictures of their girlfriend, they still went back to write FARC. EP is, it stands for Ejército del Pueblo, which means Army of the People. And then this person was part of the 6th Front. One of the issues that they had at the attention centers is how to integrate them back into if they were from indigenous background, how to integrate them back to their customs that they were deprived from while being part of the group. And so this is a cleansing ceremony and to harmonize. This is, some of the families were luckily reunited with the children. In other instances, they were never reunited with their families, so now they had to create new bonds, hopefully create a new family, and so that's what you saw over here. This work led me to follow FARC. So in 2016, Colombian government signed a peace agreement with FARC, the largest armed group, and I was given access. I lived 3 months with FARC, and my goal was to document child soldiers, and to my surprise, there were none. But what happened was most of them were adults, but they were recruited when they were children. And so a lot of them were saying, yes, I joined when I was 13, 12. I came across people as young as 6 or 9 years old. I don't know if that's recruitment. At that point, it's kidnap. But, and so they had a lot of testimonies of why, the reasons they joined. And what I saw earlier with the LN group, it was also transpiring to the FARC, is how society was going to welcome these former fighters. And there was a lot of stigma. Society is very polarized over this issue. And so for the example of Roberto, who I met, he went through the process of reintegration, moved back to his family. He was attempted to be recruited again for a second time. And this is where I found him living in a tent, because that's what he knew from the many years of training with the armed groups. I lost track of Roberto after a while. But then others were able to start their families. They were able to go on to have a civilian life, always hiding that past, because there's still a lot of stigma in Colombia and in Colombian society. I promise I'll go faster this time. I want to show this because this was another form of reintegration. So he was recruited at 16, and this was a cleansing ceremony by the indigenous community known as NASA, that's in the southern Pacific coast of Colombia. And for them, it was a way of cleansing their bodies and their spirit from being part of this evil that they saw on armed groups. But there were also consequences left to remain. There's a lot of challenges in Colombia, especially for children that were scarred by the war. In this case, Fernando, for example, stepped on a landmine and he was blind while he was a child soldier. And so there's still a lot of landmines in Colombia. And this is the girl that I said that we would come to see again with holding the eggs and the chicken. I found her later, Vida, I found her with her family. She was happily reunited. But she was struggling. She was struggling to come back to what already she knew, the scars of the conflict, and for a family that didn't know how to integrate her into her community. So there's a little bit of the photographs of that project. There's more, but I just wanted to talk about them.
Well, I want to ask, what are the conversations you have when you first want to photograph somebody at that age and tell this story? What is the kind of consent conversation you have, and how do you describe, where these images may appear and whether or not there might be consequences for them?
So in terms of consent, for the ones that photographed at the camps, the consent was given by the commander. Obviously, I would ask for permission for the fighters or the child soldiers at the time if it was okay to be photographed. Some of them chose to cover their faces, others didn't. At the attention centers, rehabilitation center, there was a much longer conversation. So my strategy was to photograph them while they were at the attention centers and then wait for them to be of 18 and ask them if they were okay. I didn't want to re-victimize them by exposing them, their images or their names, and later maybe them regretting, because that was a conversation I had. This is going to be published. This was published in the New York Times. It was also published in National Geographic. And I said, this probably is going to live in the web. And do you want to be comfortable with that? And it's going, probably someone will be able to look up your name and see these images. So I waited for them to be 18. And out of the 10 that I follow, 4 of them said they didn't want to be part of it. And I respected that. So that was sort of my strategy behind publishing some of these images. And with but most of them did want to talk. They wanted to be seen. They wanted people to hear their stories, especially because the conversation at the time in Colombia was very polarized. People didn't want these former fighters to come back into society. They saw them as terrorists, and they just didn't want them to have them in their neighborhoods, in their schools. So I think they were also trying to change a little bit that discourse. So that's how the conversation went. And then obviously with editors, it comes whether or not the person is comfortable being photographed or not.
This is so powerful. Please, let's give Juan a round of applause
Oh.
for sharing these very intimate photographs. And just the years of work that went into that, and waiting until these children turned 18 before using them, going back to them and asking them for their permission is incredibly important. So we appreciate you sharing that process. I want to just hone in on something you had just mentioned about how some of these children were treated as terrorists. And I'd like to kind of just introduce the sort of evolution of understanding of some of, children actors in armed conflicts, and how that has been cast, I think, in the era of the global war on terror. What are some of the changes and shifts that you've seen, and how is that affecting the work that you do, whether that's advocacy work or thinking through the law and other aspects of this?
For us, so I work at ChildFund Alliance right now as the senior advisor for our humanitarian work. So we work in some of the most dangerous places where we have heightened conflict right now, like in Syria, we are in Afghanistan, we are in Ukraine, in the Sahel, and a few of them, and in Gaza. So what we've seen in terms of one of the 6 grave violations against children, which I talked about in the beginning in terms of the SRSG CAC mandate, the mandate to protect children from armed conflict. One of them is the denial of humanitarian access, even though we are talking about recruitment and use, but also the denial of humanitarian access is as part of the 6 grave violations. So what we've seen is that if there are children that have been classified under these new measures, counterterrorism or whatever, and we want to get access to them to provide services, for example. So we find it a little bit difficult to be able to access the population because this population has been classified under this particular law. So being able to work with them, whether we are providing education services or health services or general protection, it is a little bit hard. So in our advocacy work that we do, because we are also operational, that means we have staff in the field. I have all my colleagues in the field that I work with and support. So part of my work in New York is to ensure that we are not putting them at risk because they are directly delivering humanitarian services. So we do our advocacy sometimes through some of the network that we are part of, which I work with closely with Ezequiel at Watchlist on children in armed conflict. And we kind of ask member states to ensure that whatever measures that they have in place should not be against what we stand for in terms of the humanitarian principles of neutrality and impartiality and all that. So it has been, so we find ourselves in a very critical position in terms of how we maintain our humanitarian principles, but at the same time provide services to people who actually need it. But because of certain counterterrorism measures, they've been classified and we cannot access them. So we continue the advocacy around those lines, which I'm sure Ezequiel will be able to talk more about.
No, thank you for this question. It's a very good one. So there are a couple of points, and I'm going to share some experiences from now Watchlist, but also my previous experience engaging with armed actors, specifically on child protection, and how these legislations that have been put in place in the last 20 years may affect those engagements. Because the main challenge is that one, is that when you work for a humanitarian organization that aims to increase the respect for the law, for instance, by preventing the use and recruitment of children, sometimes what you have to do is you have to talk to the armed actors. So as Juan said, you get the agreement of the commander to take pictures. If you're trying to convince that commander not to use and recruit children, you have to talk to that person. And I always say this, but in any given society, the circle of people who's aware of the law is very small. The circle of people who's aware of international law is even smaller. The circle of people who's aware of the law of armed conflict is even smaller. Human rights law is even smaller. So when we speak about commanders of armed groups, in Colombia, actually the knowledge that they have about international law is very high, but when we go to other places of the world, they don't know some of the definitions I mentioned before. They don't know that, in order to be an adult, you have to be 18 years old. They don't know this because in their culture or the knowledge that they have is different. So what you have to do is you have to sit down and engage with those individuals. We're all human beings. So counterterrorism laws in certain places have prevented humanitarian actors or other actors to sit down, to have that dialogue with the commanders. And that has been one of the challenges, not just for child protection, but for a broad range of humanitarian issues. If you want to negotiate the delivery of humanitarian assistance in the territory that some of these actors control, how do you do it without talking to the people in charge? If you want to bring medicine, if you want to bring food, how do you do it? If you want them to not to use and recruit children, you have to do that as well. So one way that these laws have affected this discussion is by, in certain contexts, putting some barriers on those actors that try to engage the unlawful armed groups. The second one is that one of the examples that was mentioned before is you have children being detained for being associated with armed actors. So you have children who have been victimized multiple times because they have been forcibly recruited by one armed actor, and then the other side detains them for that forced association. In some places, this has fallen under counterterrorism, anti-terrorism laws. So, again, you have multiple victimization of the children in these situations that when you're trying to do advocacy and you try to say, these kids, they have been victims of an original violation by being forcibly used and recruited. So I would say these are the two main challenges. And then, related to the second one is the prosecution of children for this association as well. So again, you have different issues on how these anti-terrorism or counter-terrorism laws have affected the issue of children in armed conflict. Yeah.
I just want to add, in the example of Colombia, FARC always denied recruiting children. And so when the peace process came about, they vehemently denied having any children. There was a gesture, they thought it was a humanitarian gesture of just handing over about 50, I think it was the number. But the estimates after the Truth Commission came about 2 years ago was as high as 16,000 children. Somebody put them up to 20,000 children have been, over a span of 30 years, have been recruited at this. So it is a challenge, not only for registries, but also a challenge of how do you negotiate with an armed group who is trying to give up their arms in return of an exchange with children.
May I add something? No, I thought this was quite interesting. You raised 2 points that I thought I've written them down. One is that in many of these places, there is no government. So the national government is not present. So when you think about, they're going to have access to basic services, IDs. They don't have government issue IDs, So it's like, for instance, I was in touch in the DRC, in Congo, with communities. They didn't know how well the kids were, So in many of these places, one was saying, the armed groups have taken the role of, I would say, the rebel governance activities in those territories. That's what happens, Nowadays you have millions of people living under control of armed groups around the world. Numbers have put forward by the ICRC says that around 64 million people live under full control of armed groups around the world, and 100 more live under, other types of control. And the second point is that, you have two groups in the same context that may operate differently, So you have perhaps the ELN and the FARC here. This point of, not having, first of all, that actors are dynamic in nature. In certain contexts, they might use and recruit children actively. In other contexts, for instance, they are negotiating a peace agreement or about to sign a peace agreement. They stop that practice, at least as a policy of the group. You might have afterwards certain cases, and in the certain units or fronts. And then you have another group operating in the same country that actively uses and recruits children in the conflict, So how this these dynamic effects, the whole setting is also quite important to analyze and to understand. Yeah.
I've, in my own work, so, looking at lethal targeting, I often, in the documents that I've obtained, I see references to military-aged male, or like a MAM. It'll often be acronymed in some of these reports, and, there'll be descriptions of, somebody was dragging a heavy object into a building, and later on they would say, actually, it appears to be a person of small stature standing next to, in the way a child would appear standing next to an adult. Like, they couldn't just call this person a child. When they were looking at this, it was a person of small stature who looked like the way a child would appear standing next to an adult. Like this incredible sort of, at least in these documents and in this rendering from the air, the way that children, and particularly male children, are characterized, can be very different, at least, than what I see on the ground at times. And, I've certainly been in places where I've seen ISIS, for example, recruit, exploit, and victimize children and then leave them. We've seen children who have been rounded up in camps, and, they're called ISIS families, is how they're often referred to, but they're in places like Al-Hol in Syria and other camps where they're essentially just, the government doesn't know what to do with them, and they don't know how to treat them, especially as they get older, and they don't really get a good education. They're not living a life where they have access to different opportunities. What are some of the ways in which you've seen attempts to deal with some of those populations, these people kind of rounded up as they age and get older and hit 18 and above even? What is the approach that you're seeing with them?
No, thank you very much. This is also a very good question. I would say it really depends on the context. So some of the challenges that you just raised might be present in certain places, but not in others. And so the strategies that have been put in place are different, and it's context dependent. So the example that you just mentioned, for instance, in Syria, now you have 30,000 kids, or no, 30,000 people, but you have thousands of kids being detained in northeast Syria by an armed group, by the way. So this is the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria that has detained these people in Al-Hol, Al-Rosh, and for alleged association with the Islamic State, because many of these have not been prosecuted, at least not, no for trial, and they're still in these places. So they're different. So this is one specific problem that has led to certain measures. One has been certain states have repatriated their nationals, including children, from those camps. The problem is in those camps you have Syrian kids as well, so that entails a negotiation between Damascus and the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria on what to do, or the administration to do something. But then you have humanitarian actors visiting some of these camps, maybe even bringing some services, that can be provided there. Because again, we're speaking about a non-state actor, not even a state. So I had this discussion with respect to COVID-19. When COVID-19 hit, some governments were receiving vaccines, for instance. How do you deal with the Autonomous Administration of Northeast Syria had millions of people under their control, including the people in these camps? So the fact that this is a non-state actor entails additional challenges. From a humanitarian perspective, the initiative that has been put in place and has been at the forefront has been to try to directly negotiate with the authorities. And it could be to improve the situation of the children in detention, if this is a problem you're dealing with, or even to get access to the children in detention, you need to know how many kids are detained. This is information that is not public, and you need to get access to the detention facilities. You need to see in which situation they are, what's their access to food, nutrition information that you don't have, whether they have access to medicine, if there is, malaria, cholera, all these things, in order to get that information, so you need access. And then once you have the information, you see what you can do in terms of either bringing medicine, bringing food, or even advocating for the kids to be released or to get a proper process, or to be repatriated, depending on the organization you work on. But this is only for Syria. In other places, it depends a lot on the context.
I would add, for example, what I saw in Colombia was there was always not only a challenge to dealing with active combatants, but it was also the reintegration process. Because as you mentioned, in the Middle East, but in Colombia, they have, you do military service is mandatory. So by the time you're 16 or 17, you need to enlist. And so in some of these places, you end up being part of the army, but if you have been recruited, you already have a bad pass, a judicial pass. So how do you deal with that? Some of them chose to join the armed group because that would mean they would be closer to home, they would be closer to their community, and as opposed to going to some city, doing the military service, and then coming back. Now, if you came back after military service, in that area, if the armed group was operating, you will be seen as an enemy because now you serve the other side. So you find children on a roadblock that it didn't know what to do. Like, do I enlist? Do I do not enlist? Do I become part of this group? And then once you did the reintegration process, you needed to have an ID that said that you turned in your weapons and that you were foreign combatant. So it was almost like a scarlet letter that now they had to carry with them wherever they went, and that pass is always going to follow them. So I think the challenges, at least in Colombia, what I saw was how to reintegrate them to avoid this stigmatization of the children there too. But like Ezequiel said, it's a case by case. I think now also the conflict morphs. In Colombia, how it started 50, 60 years ago is very different from what it is right now. And so recruitment now is more fueled by recruiting bodies, so you can protect cocoa fields, so you can export cocaine to outside. No longer we have this mentality of Marxism, Leninism, rebels. It's more fueled by having private armies to protect the process of cocaine. Yeah.
Did you want to add anything? Okay. I want to just kind of ask you guys to kind of grapple with a hypothetical here, because I know there's lots of journalists in the audience, but I'd like to get each of your perspectives on, let's say there's a reporter. They've arrived at El Hol, and they have a chance to photograph some children who are being held there and tell their stories. What would be the ethical approach? Like, how would you balance the sort of public interest? And maybe we'll start with Juan as a journalist and then turn to the others. But how do you sort of balance, like, why you're telling this story, what objectives you would need to meet for it, and the way you would approach it?
It's a hard question because it has all these layers, right, of representation. Am I the right person to be telling that story as a Latin American in Syria? But leaving that aside, I think I would have to make sure I have consent as the very first thing. It's like, what is it that we're trying to achieve with this? Is it necessary to have their faces being shown? Can we have, and this is why I think I advocate for thinking of what's the best medium for our story. It doesn't have to be photographs. It could be audio. It could be written. So it's thinking what would be the one that causes the less harm to our subjects in this case. I don't like to treat them as subjects. I think they're collaborators. So how do you protect collaborators? How do you protect them from being re-victimized? Because you don't want to have them sit down, tell their story again, relive it, and then have it maybe come back to them later on in life. So I think that's a conversation you need to have down with the nonprofit or the publication that you're doing, and as a journalist, is like, what is this, what we're trying to achieve? And once you have those safeguards in place, I would try to, have consent from the families. I've never met with any of the children if there was not an adult present there. Now, when they were 18, that was another game. If I was in the camps, it was very different because it was the commander, right? So I'm always thinking of those things, and I think it's just having those safe rails in place.
Yeah, so from my end, as someone who's worked in child protection for a long time, we do start with thinking through the protection concerns, especially if we feel like the story will have some impact on the safety of the child or the person. So as part of our work, we've developed specific guidelines for working with the media, because we do have our own internal teams. We are program people, but we have our colleagues who are in fundraising and communication. So a lot of the time we are, cross-checking our guidelines to ensure that our colleagues that are, trying to run a story for fundraising, maybe for our work in DRC or in northern Nigeria, in Syria, they're aware of some of the protection concerns that we have. In as much as we want the funds to do our work, we also don't want to further put children at risk by telling their story. So those are some of the safeguards we have in place. And of course, the issue of consent, we also talk to the children themselves and let them know. So as part of my work I do at ChildFund is also work on our children's participation policy and guidelines. So we train these children in terms of knowing their rights and on child participation. So we always say that the protection and participation, the two of them are one. But how do you, increase children's agency to talk about their story, but at the same time ensuring that they are protected? So we do have way too many of these in place to be able to work with people on that. Right.
And then Ezequiel, I'm gonna just tell you all there's a mic at the back of the room, and so maybe after this we can start going to questions. So if people would like to line up at the mic to ask questions to the panel, like now would be a good time to start queuing, but go ahead.
No, I have nothing else. Yeah.
They just killed that answer. That's perfect.
I can just say that, just to add that from a humanitarian perspective, there is this principle that humanitarian actors rely on, that is the principle of do not harm. So every measure that you take in a conflict setting, you avoid that, to affect victims negatively. And of course, specifically when you're speaking about children, this is, but I think it has already been said. Yeah.
Okay, so while we wait for people to line up to ask questions, I want to come back to some of the work that Faith and Ezequiel that you're doing now on some of these issues. What are some of the obstacles that you're confronting as you're trying to go about advancing the protections of children? What are you finding in more recent years that can be the most challenging for your work?
I think for my part, I think warfare has taken, on a new sort of a dynamic, right? So you had, when we first started, children were being, recruited and given guns. These days, you have mass adoption of children. You have children being used as suicide bombers, like in places, and then of course you have these laws that Ezequiel just mentioned that would generalize a group of population. So all of these things have created a new way of us thinking how we do work with children. And we always talk about our campaign where we say their children are soldiers, but at the same time we accept the fact that the crimes that have been committed, they're against people as well. And these are the same communities that we are going to, and we are asking them to accept these children. So so you have to also accept the fact that in as much as they're children, there were crimes that were committed against people who live in this community, and they want accountability. So I think for me, the main issue is how do you hold people to account who have turn these children into soldiers, and then they're being further victimized by another set of laws. So it's challenging in that way, but we're also hopeful that as we continue to engage with member states, we continue to engage with parties to conflict, and we also continue to engage children, we are finding solutions to see how we address some of these.
believed that what they chose was their best option. And then when you're reintegrating them, you're sort of saying that they did something wrong. But is it, I'm curious to hear sort of from the perspective of what are the skills that they learned that are actually usable as they move forward, and can we take a perspective of trying to give it a more positive spin, and also acknowledging that for some kids this was their best choice. So that just wanted to raise that.
And I can answer some of the, at least for the Colombian case. So language is very important because in Colombia we don't have that term child soldiers. We refer to them as combatants, right? So, and then I think that language changes wherever you go. I think it's more of a international of child soldiers. So in Colombia, I never came across as like, oh, they're children or they're teenagers. But they all, I think everyone agreed that they were deprived of their childhood. So, and then you're absolutely right, that you're being punished because you think you made a wrong decision when the circumstances around of how they joined an armed group could have been many, and maybe they thought that they were doing the right thing. So at least I feel like the places that I visited, the communities that I visited that were trying to reintegrate the children or the adolescents, their language that was trying to do is to give back their rights as a teenager, as a child, and also as a citizen. So so sometimes that's why, like, the language of terrorism, we, at least in Colombia, we don't refer to FARC combatants as terrorists. We just call them guerrilleros, guerrilla fighters. That already has a stigma. So it depends on, like, where do you use that sort of language. But in Colombia, I never saw a definition of saying, okay, they're niños, or like children, or they're teenagers. They were just clumped up in one thing, and perhaps that's something that needs to be addressed. Yeah, but in at least in the last report that it was the Truth Commission is very clearly stated they're boys, girls, and teenagers. So there is a differentiation there.
For us, I think for programming, when we are doing programs for children that have been affected by conflict, we try to focus our definition on the UNCRC that Ezequiel mentioned, under the age of 18. My organization, we are child focused, and so we do our program based on people who are 18 and under, but we do have programs for adolescents who are over the age of 21. So that's where we try to keep our definition. And in terms of the terms child soldiers, like he said, in my context, they were referred to as rebels. They never said child soldiers. They were just rebels. Yeah. So, of course, there are many different terminology to describe it.
Maybe one point from my end is that these are the terms that perhaps international law refers to, but that doesn't mean that when there is a process of demobilization of children, that the measures that are going to be taken with respect to those children are not adapted to their age. So yes, international law would say below the age of 18, you're a kid. That doesn't mean that when, for instance, a child is released from a group and the government takes that kid, that's not going to be, the measure is not going to be the same as if that person is 15, 12, 6, or 17. It's a very context-dependent measure and response that the government will take, and it will depend on different factors. One of the points that Juan mentioned is that perhaps the kids cannot go back to their communities. Okay, how old are these kids? It's like, and what type of, do they need to go back to some educational facility? Is that the priority? Or, it really depends on the age and the context they lived in, and it's something that ideally the government will have to address when defining the strategy. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Nandini. Thank you so much for being here. I know we talked about the best practices that journalists can take when reporting on child soldiers. So I wanted to ask you, what are some things that the media and the news get wrong?
Where do you start?
Well, I know there are lots of journalists in here, but as a practitioner and someone who's working in child protection, I think sometimes the anticipation to tell a story, right? At times, and it's a human story, so you want to go out with the story called in the name of the child, the place, the location, and all of that, and because you want to tell the story. But what we do in child protection is we try to tell the story in the most anonymous way as best as we can. So we tell our colleagues we don't list the real name. We sometimes have to either cover the face, and we don't really state the actual location of where, yeah. So most time when I do bring children and young people even to the UN to participate in processes, we tell the story. We try to tell our media colleagues to please leave out the identifying information. And I don't know if as a journalist it takes away from you for your story and the way you want it to be told, but like we said, we always try to do the protection part as well.
I have to also add to this. So I think for me it's easy to fall into the whole, try to grab the low-hanging fruit, which is to sensationalize something like this, right? These were children who did, at times, very horrific acts that they shouldn't have to do. I didn't focus on that. I focused on who they are and where they're heading. So you have, as a journalist, you have that. You can do that, right? You can choose what side of the story you're going to focus on. I didn't focus on the horrific acts that they committed. I didn't want to amplify that voice of saying, oh, these are bad people, these are bad actors. I saw them from, and I also had to challenge my prejudgments coming in. Growing up in Colombia, you either were pro or against the rebel fighters. That was it. There was no middle ground. My family's very conservative, I'm not, and so it challenged me, right? So going into these camps and hearing their stories, you just have to shed all of that. And for me, it was just being open-minded about the reasons why they joined. It's easy to judge them, it's easy to paint them in a negative light, and I think that's where the media gets it wrong, and especially if you have an agenda. I wanted to see the human part of it. Like, what is the toll, what is the cost? And I'm fortunate to work in a long-term project, because then I can see an arc. Others don't, and they have to publish something fast, and so just avoid those cliches and those tropes of trying to paint them. A lot of rebels were bad and are bad, but I'm trying to understand them, and so for that you really have to have compassion, sit down, and just listen, and that's my advice.
So again, I'm not a journalist, so I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to speak from a legal perspective. I think sometimes some legal concepts can be better explained. So just to give you a couple of examples, that there have been different situations that are addressed by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice recently. So in some mass media, there has been quite a confusion on which court is dealing with which situation, for instance. So again, not as Watchlist, but as a lawyer who has studied international law, I had to say, the International Court of Justice is not prosecuting individuals. Just to give you an example, or the International Criminal Court is not prosecuting states. And this is something that, if a lawyer, but I don't want to promote journalists to consult lawyers, but if a lawyer had been consulted, they would have said, or international humanitarian law or human rights law, these type of things. Yeah, I think, I don't want to generalize. I'm just giving you the example of the ICC and the ICJ because it's something that was recently observed this year, actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, hello. Thanks to the panel. My name is Ryan. I'm a student at the Program of Forced Migration and Health, School of Public Health here at Columbia. I wanted to ask, the panel has been speaking a lot about addressing the issue of child soldiers either after recruitment or during reintegration, but I guess I'm wondering if there are actions or programs to strengthen the resiliency of communities before children are recruited, preparedness actions that can be done more upstream to either prevent that recruitment from happening, or to strengthen the resiliency and decrease stigma among communities once children are reintegrated back into those communities. I don't know if ChildFund or Watchlist are advocating for any of those kinds of programs or know of any. That'd be interesting to know. Thank you.
So yeah, thank you very much for that question. I think for us at ChildFund, our tagline is prevention of violence against children. That's what we do, ending violence and prevention of violence against children. And recruitment and use is a form of violence against children. So we do have prevention programs in communities where we work with grassroots organizations and our local partners and families to be able to prevent children from being recruited in the first place. So that's part of what we do. And we do have direct programs, and we also do advocacy as well as other forms of policy work among our members all over the world where we work. So, but if it does happen and we have to respond, which is another part of the work we do, the prevention and awareness, and then there's the response. We design programs that are age appropriate and also community informed in terms of how they work with these children that have been part of the fighting forces in the first place as part of the reintegration program. It's a long process of how we do that. It's around, like I mentioned, our community strengthening project. We has to do with psychosocial support for children and for communities on how to work with these children. So, and there's education program, livelihoods program for boys and girls who maybe can no longer go back to regular school, and accelerated programs. So there are different kinds of programs that we do. I can talk to you more about that if you want to know a little bit more about what we do. Thank you.
Maybe just to add, I think it's a very, very good question, because we've been discussing about victims, and we've been placing children and civilians as victims of cases of abuse and recruitment. But in many conflict situations, communities are quite active in self-protecting themselves. So this is something that it doesn't need the help of an external actor for them to stand up and say, kids are not going to be recruited from this community. This is something that happens, and it happens in many different situations, both with respect to non-state actors and respect to state actors. So what has happened is that that humanitarian organizations or external organizations engage with communities, community leaders, for them to have the tools to stand up in front of armed actors, again, with the principle of do not harm in mind, not to place them at risk, but for them also to know what are their rights, their protections, their safeguards when you have an armed actor coming and wanting to, for instance, recruit a kid, or when children want to voluntarily join the armed actor as well. So engagement with local communities happen for this to be prevented. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Matthew. I'm also a student with the program on forced migration and health. Thank you to all the panelists for a wonderful discussion today. I was wondering, we've discussed several groups with a pretty wide range of ideological motivations for fighting. FARC has its ideology, the Autonomous Administration of Northern Syria and groups like YPG have an ideology, maybe less so with an organization that's just doing like coca production or something. But I'm curious, to what degree did children that you're aware of involved in armed conflict engage with the ideologies of the groups that they were fighting with, and to what degree did demobilization or integration programs contend with the ideological components of being involved in armed service?
So in my case, there were a lot of children that were with a particular armed group, and in times of, when we were doing the mobilization to have them disarmed, because they said they love their commanders so much and the ideology of the group, they did not want to leave. And so we had to really go through a lot of other engagement now with the commanders to say, look, you have to work with us to tell these children that the time of fighting is over. There's been a ceasefire, and now is the time for them to come to us, the child protection actors or organizations, civil society, to go through their own rehabilitation and then be reunified. And I remember in certain cases, it was not only because the conflict was across West Africa, Liberia, Sierra Leone, horrific war in Sierra Leone, where children were even marked by some of the fighting groups wrote on the back of these children, RUF. So, and they had all the, and UNICEF had to do surgery to get some of the armed groups mark of these children. It was very hard to kind of separate them from those people because they've been there for a long time and they felt like that was their safe space. So they didn't really trust us. But so the armed commanders at the time played a key role in helping them to detach and come to us. And some of them even said to them, oh, we are also going through our own demobilization and reintegration. And afterwards, we can all meet one of these days as real ordinary citizen again. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I experienced and what I saw was basically the challenges were to overcome that sense of a lot of the teenagers that I spoke, they felt deceit at the end. What was it all for? Some of them were in favor. I mean, they missed. I think they reminisced coming back to the group because they felt a sense of community. They felt they had some power, and it was more of this longing of belonging to something. And now that they were just civilians, that was where I saw them struggle. But in terms of ideology, by the time they joined these groups have been older than 40 years, so they've lost that mentality of kind of overthrow the government, communism, all of that. But they were in some ways brainwashed to believe that this is what they were doing that was the right thing. So it was more of missing this lifestyle that now they will never go back to, and this unknown of becoming a civilian and what is that like for them. So that's where I saw the biggest struggle for them to reintegrate.
From my side is the only thing I would add, because I think everything was said already, is that it goes into the root causes of recruitment, if you want. So if it's because of ideology or if it's because of other reasons, economy, for instance, and then it's like what's the message that they get when they are recruited? Is it because again they are fighting a government that is an oppressor government against the people, or it's because of there is this religious discussion, or is it because an economical, financial decision? So I think the discussion of the ideology goes into the root causes of the problem, which is broader than just ideology. Ideology could be one of the elements to consider, but there might be other elements to bring to the equation as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay, awesome. Hi, thank you so much for doing this. My name's Sarah. I am a documentary producer and a video journalist. And I've done a few child labor reporting pieces, and oftentimes we'll go in for 2 days, we'll have a shoot, we'll show the very tough working conditions, and then we'll leave. And then we'll publish, and a bunch of viewers will go and be like, oh my goodness, that child, we care about them so much. And they'll want to get in contact, we'll put our fixer in place, and they'll more or less connect that person who's trying to help with the actual child. And what I'm wondering, I'm kind of ruminating about this because of your point about going back and asking those kids once they've turned 18, hey, do you want to be covered? Do you want your name out there? I'm kind of wondering how, as reporters that you guys have all seen in the field, how that access, that contact that you have, if that's actually in some way as viewers or as readers, how that's kind of played out in the field.
Sorry, I'm just trying to think through the question. So for me, has always been, I'm just trying to think. So one of them is I always keep in contact with them. So I always keep their contacts because I like to keep a conversation. This was 4 years in the making, so it took me 4 years. By that time, you build relationships, you build trust, and I'm always checking to see how they're doing. To give you a backstory quickly, there was a backlash from the government when we published this. So of the 5 children that were in the piece, in the New York Times piece, 4 of them got their benefits removed as a sort of punishment. So I went to crisis mode because I felt, oh, I caused harm. And I never thought the government would go that far to do that. So I had to meet with them, apologize, explain to them, and I was lucky that there were people who were willing to help them. So I think there's a moment where you have to take your journalism hat and just be a person and be a human and care for them. And I just always check on them and see. I've lost over time contact. This question of waiting to be 18, I early on I had a conversation with my editor, but also with colleagues to say, how do I play this? How do I do this so I cause less harm? So I waited until they were 18. Sometimes you don't have that privilege. I think nowadays we do have to be more careful and just foresee what possibilities, once that piece is out, it's going to live on a web, it's going to be published, their name is going to be associated with something that they may not want to be associated with anymore. And so what can happen with that? And if they have agency to say yes or no.
Maybe, because I'm reflecting on the question from a humanitarian perspective. Some humanitarian actors, they gather information on possible violations from the victims, and that violation might be used also with the alleged perpetrator. So I'm just saying that there is a conversation with some of the victims that is not journalistic in nature, but there is an issue of expectations that sometimes is created from the people that you're interviewing, not for journalistic purposes, but for somehow that something is going to change. And at least from a humanitarian organization perspective, it's very important that these expectations are managed. So again, I assume that maybe, but I'm speaking without any knowledge, that when you talk to these kids or individuals that you interview also, there might be some expectations. So I guess managing those expectations, so what might happen after is quite relevant. From a humanitarian actor perspective, is essential. So because this can lead into it can affect situations afterwards. No.
Well, thank you. I want to thank each of you for providing such incredible insights from your own experience in the field, from the law, from your photography, Juan, which is really arresting, and I feel so lucky that we got to have such an intimate walkthrough of all of that. Thank you for illuminating this for me, and I know that so many here are going to bring this back to their fields, whether that's public health, whether that's journalism. So we're very grateful to each of you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.